On a quiet summer night in 2008, a Greyhound bus ride through rural Canada turned into a scene of unthinkable horror. A young man's life was stolen in the most brutal way, leaving passengers, police, and an entire nation shaken. This is the chilling story you can't look away from. On the evening of July 30th, 2008, the Trans-Canada Highway stretched endlessly across the flat, quiet lands of Manitoba. It was a routine summer night, warm but still, the type of evening where the hum of a Greyhound bus felt almost hypnotic as it carried its passengers westward. For many on board, the bus was simply a means to get from one destination to the next, a temporary shared space where strangers sat side by side, lost in their own private worlds. Among them was a young man named Tim McLean, just 22 years old, heading home to Winnipeg after a long day of work at a carnival. By all accounts, Tim was in high spirits. He had been working hard, living a free-spirited life full of travel and energy, and now he was looking forward to being home. He slipped into his seat, placed his headphones on, and drifted into his music, detached from the hum of voices and the low vibration of the bus beneath him. Tim was the type of person others remembered with warmth. Friends later recalled his magnetic personality, his kindness, and his ability to light up a room without even trying. To his family, he was not just a son but a cherished soul who carried an infectious optimism that made them proud. On the bus, he was simply another passenger, resting after a long day, unaware that fate had placed him in the path of a man whose mind was unraveling in terrifying ways. Sitting further away at first was another passenger, Vince Waiguang Lee. At 40 years old, Lee was a man with a complicated past, one that most people on that bus couldn't have guessed by his outward appearance. He was an immigrant from China who had arrived in Canada in 2001, seeking a new life and better opportunities. 4 years he worked various jobs, delivering newspapers, laboring in service roles, and keeping mostly to himself. Those who encountered him described him as quiet, polite, even shy. Yet behind his subdued exterior was a man tormented by inner demons. For years, Lee had been experiencing symptoms of severe schizophrenia, though at the time of this journey he had not received effective treatment. He was plagued by voices, hallucinations that convinced him of imminent dangers and cosmic threats. On this particular day, those voices grew louder, demanding action. Witnesses described Lee as calm when he first boarded. He carried very little, just a small bag and a large hunting knife, which at the time drew no suspicion. He sat by himself, staring out of the window, lost in thought. But as the bus rolled deeper into the Manitoba night, he rose and walked toward McLean's seat. To the passengers who noticed, it seemed unremarkable. A stranger choosing a new spot, a common enough act during a long trip. He settled beside the sleeping Tim, his expression unreadable. No one could have anticipated the violence that was about to erupt. In the next moments, what began as an ordinary bus ride descended into an unimaginable nightmare. Without warning, Lee reached into his belongings, produced the hunting knife, and began stabbing McLean in a frenzy of motion. The attack was swift, brutal, and incomprehensible. Passengers screamed as chaos exploded inside the confined space. The driver swerved the bus to the side of the highway, pulling it to a stop. People scrambled to escape, shoving down the aisle, pushing past one another, desperate to get out. The horror of what they had seen was seared into their memories forever. A young man being attacked without provocation, his life stolen in seconds by a stranger who seemed possessed by something inhuman. Those who managed to get off the bus stumbled onto the roadside, their voices rising in panic as they tried to process what was happening. Some passengers stood frozen, staring back at the windows of the bus, unable to comprehend the brutality taking place inside. Others called emergency services, their voices trembling as they tried to explain what could barely be put into words. The driver, displaying remarkable composure amid the chaos, acted swiftly to disable the vehicle, removing the keys so that the attacker could not use it to flee. He, along with a handful of passengers, attempted to contain the situation, but what they saw through the glass left them shaken to their core. Inside, Lee showed no sign of stopping. He continued stabbing relentlessly, then shifted into an act of savagery so grotesque that those watching could hardly believe it was real. He decapitated McLean, lifting his severed head in view of the horrified passengers outside, as if to warn them not to approach. The scene was surreal, a collision between the ordinary and the unthinkable. The highway, normally a symbol of movement and transition, had become a place of paralysis and dread. Those who had escaped stood helpless. Some wanted to rush back in, driven by instinct to save the young man. But each time they tried, Lee brandished the knife, threatening anyone who dared to come closer. The bus was his domain now, and inside it he continued acts that defied comprehension. Witnesses later recalled with tears and trembling voices how he began to cut parts of McLean's body, consuming some as if the act were ritualistic. Outside, passengers wept, screamed, and begged for it to end. Their lives, like Tim's, had been irreversibly altered. When police finally arrived, they found the group of traumatized passengers gathered at the roadside, their accounts fragmented and frantic. The officers moved quickly to surround the bus, establishing a perimeter while trying to assess the danger inside. Lee, still armed, moved through the interior with calm precision, as though he were operating under a force beyond reason. Hours passed as negotiators attempted to communicate, but he remained mostly unresponsive. At one point, he tried to escape through a window, only to be driven back by police intervention. The standoff stretched into the night, the flashing lights illuminating a scene that felt more like a waking nightmare than a crime scene. For the passengers who had witnessed the attack, the hours were unbearable. Some clung to each other for comfort, while others sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with shock. The weight of helplessness pressed down on them. There had been nothing they could do to save Tim, no way to alter the horrific trajectory of that night. By the time officers finally subdued Lee using non-lethal weapons and secured him in custody, the damage had already been done. The scene inside the bus was one of indescribable horror, a crime so grotesque that even seasoned investigators struggled to process it. As dawn broke, the reality of the night's events began to sink in. News of the attack spread quickly, first through local reports, then across the nation and the world. Headlines captured the sheer brutality in stark, unsettling detail, and Canada awoke to the chilling realization that a random act of violence had claimed the life of a young man in a manner too horrific to fully comprehend. The public's shock was immediate and overwhelming. Questions swirled. Who was Vince Lee? Why had he committed such an atrocity? And how could something so random and senseless happen on a quiet bus ride through the Canadian prairies? In those early hours, however, the focus was not yet on explanations. It was on the unbearable loss of Tim McLean, a vibrant young man whose life had been cut short in the most horrific way imaginable. His family was informed, their grief compounded by the nightmarish details of the attack. For them, Tim was not a headline or a symbol. He was a son, a brother, and a friend, ripped from their lives in an act of unexplainable madness. The story of the Greyhound bus murder had only just begun, but already it was clear that it would leave scars not only on those who had been there but on an entire country that struggled to reconcile its image of safety and civility with the monstrous violence that had erupted in the middle of a summer night. The arrest of Vince Lee on the roadside that night ended the immediate horror, but it was only the beginning of a story that would unfold in courts, hospitals, and in the public conscience of Canada for years to come. In the hours after police subdued him, investigators carefully entered the bus and found a scene so gruesome that hardened officers later admitted it was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Evidence was collected with grim precision, yet each detail only confirmed the brutality of the crime. Forensic teams photographed the interior, cataloging the knife, the remains, and the disarray left by terrified passengers who had fled for their lives. The silence inside contrasted with the chaos that had erupted only hours before, and every image taken that night would later become a chilling reminder of the violence that had unfolded. As Lee was taken into custody, his demeanor puzzled those who encountered him. He was not combative or hysterical. Instead, he seemed detached, almost serene, as though the enormity of his actions had not registered in a conventional sense. For officers accustomed to suspects who fought or begged, this quiet compliance was unsettling. It was clear to many that this was not a typical criminal act. It bore the hallmarks of something far more complex, something rooted in a mind consumed by delusions. That distinction, however, would not ease the grief of Tim McLean's family, nor the trauma of the passengers who had witnessed the unimaginable. In the days that followed, media coverage was relentless. News outlets across the globe carried the story of the Greyhound bus murder, and the details spread quickly through television, newspapers, and online forums. Canada, a country that often prided itself on relative safety and order, was shaken to its core. The randomness of the act terrified the public. Anyone could be sitting on a bus, on a train, or in a public place when violence might erupt without warning. For the McLean family, these headlines were like daggers. Tim's parents, Carol Dedeli and her husband, struggled not only with the loss of their son, but also with the way his final moments were replayed endlessly in the media. To them, Tim was more than the victim of a headline-making crime. He was their child, a young man with dreams and a future that had been savagely stolen. As investigators pieced together Lee's background, a portrait emerged of a man who had once seemed harmless. Born in Dandong, China, in 1968, Lee had emigrated to Canada in 2001 with his wife, Anna. Those who had known him described him as soft-spoken and hard-working, a man who took on low-paying jobs without complaint. He had worked delivering newspapers in Edmonton and Winnipeg, even volunteering at a church, where members recalled his quiet presence. Nothing in his outward life suggested the capacity for such brutality. But behind that calm exterior, his mental health was deteriorating. He began experiencing auditory hallucinations, voices that convinced him he was being watched or that dark forces were conspiring against him. In the weeks leading up to the attack, his paranoia escalated, and he became increasingly restless and withdrawn. The passengers who had witnessed the murder were left to grapple with their trauma in the aftermath. Some spoke to the press in trembling voices, recounting the sheer terror of being trapped on the bus. One described how the screams of passengers had been drowned out by the horrific sounds of the attack. Another admitted they could not close their eyes without reliving the sight of Lee raising the knife again and again. These accounts painted a picture not only of McLean's suffering but of the collective scar inflicted on those who lived through the ordeal. Many would later require therapy, haunted by recurring nightmares and survivor's guilt. They asked themselves if they could have done more, even though rationally they knew the situation had been beyond their control. When Lee appeared in court for the first time, the public crowded into the small Manitoba courtroom, desperate for answers. His head was shaved, his expression blank, and he spoke little. He was charged with second-degree murder, though the legal process quickly shifted focus to his mental state. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate him, and their findings confirmed what many suspected. Lee was in the grip of severe paranoid schizophrenia at the time of the attack. He told doctors that he had heard the voice of God, commanding him to kill McLean, whom he believed was a dangerous alien intent on harming others. In his delusion, the attack was not an act of cruelty but one of supposed necessity, a twisted mission to save humanity. This revelation sparked a contentious debate. For some, the diagnosis provided context, if not comfort, for the otherwise senseless crime. For others, it was infuriating, as it suggested that Lee might escape the harshest legal punishment. Carol Dedeli, Tim's mother, became a vocal figure in the aftermath, demanding justice for her son and questioning how someone who had committed such a horrific act could ever be considered anything other than criminally responsible. Her grief fueled a campaign to reform Canada's laws regarding the treatment of violent offenders found not criminally responsible due to mental illness. She argued that the public safety should always come first and that families of victims deserved more than legal technicalities and psychiatric evaluations. The case eventually went to trial in March 2009, and the proceedings captivated the nation. Courtroom testimony was chilling, as psychiatrists described Lee's delusions in detail. They explained how untreated schizophrenia had driven him into a state where he could no longer distinguish reality from hallucination. One doctor noted that Lee genuinely believed Tim McLean was a supernatural entity, not a human being, and that the attack was his only way to stop the threat. With such evidence, the outcome became clear. Lee was found not criminally responsible for the murder. Instead of prison, He was ordered to be confined in a secure psychiatric facility under the supervision of the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board. The ruling ignited outrage among many Canadians. To Tim's family, it felt like justice had been denied, that the law had placed the rights of the perpetrator above the suffering of the victim and his loved ones. In the weeks following the verdict, debates raged on talk shows, in newspapers, and across dinner tables. Some defended the decision, pointing out that Lee was profoundly ill and that punishment would serve no purpose without treatment. Others, however, feared that labeling him as not criminally responsible meant he could one day be released back into society, a possibility that filled them with dread. Inside the psychiatric facility, Lee began treatment with antipsychotic medication and intensive therapy. Doctors observed that his symptoms gradually diminished, and over time, he expressed remorse for his actions. He claimed he no longer heard the voices that once commanded him, and he spoke about his shame and horror at what he had done. But for the McLean family, these expressions meant little. Their son was gone, their lives shattered, and no amount of rehabilitation could undo the crime. For them, the pain was permanent, and the idea that the man responsible could ever walk free again was unbearable. By the end of that first year after the attack, the murder of Tim McLean had transformed from a shocking crime into a national reckoning. Canada was forced to confront difficult questions about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and public safety. Was it possible to treat someone who had committed an act of such violence and then reintroduce them into society? Could a balance ever be struck between compassion for the mentally ill and justice for victims? These questions would linger for years, shaping not only legal policies but also the private lives of those forever touched by the tragedy on that bus in Manitoba. The years following the verdict were marked by a tense balance between medical treatment, public anger, and the unrelenting grief of Tim McLean's family. While Vince Lee remained confined in a secure psychiatric facility, every update about his progress reignited the trauma. Doctors reported that with medication and consistent supervision, Lee's delusions had subsided, and he was responding to treatment in ways that showed stability. But for those who had lost the most, Tim's parents, siblings, and friends, these reports did not ease their pain. The man they loved was never coming back, and his final moments had been replayed in gruesome detail in their minds, forever seared into their memories. The media continued to follow the case closely, charting Lee's progress and the debates surrounding him. Each year, the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board held hearings to evaluate whether his condition warranted a change in his confinement. These hearings became moments of dread for the McLean family, who attended whenever possible to ensure their voices were heard. They spoke passionately, often tearfully, about their son's life and about their fear that the man responsible for his death might one day walk free. To them, no medical improvement could erase the horror of what had been done, nor could it guarantee that violence would not happen again. Meanwhile, the public remained deeply divided. Some Canadians sympathized with Lee's situation, acknowledging that untreated schizophrenia had driven him into a psychotic state and that his actions had been beyond his conscious control. To them, his case was a tragic reminder of the need for better mental health care and early intervention. Others, however, felt betrayed by the system. They argued that Tim's life had been taken in a manner so brutal that it defied comprehension, and yet the man responsible might eventually regain his freedom. This tension fueled petitions, protests, and heated discussions across the country. As time passed, Lee's privileges began to expand cautiously. In 2012, he was granted supervised outings, escorted by staff from the psychiatric hospital. Each step triggered outrage from Tim's family and many members of the public. For Carol Dedeli, these decisions were like fresh wounds. She believed that the system valued the rehabilitation of the perpetrator more than the suffering of victims and their families. Her grief turned into advocacy, as she began campaigning for changes to Canada's laws surrounding those found not criminally responsible. She called for stricter rules to keep violent offenders in secure facilities permanently, arguing that no level of treatment could justify their release. Her efforts gained national attention, and she became one of the most outspoken voices for victims' rights in the country. Lee's doctors, however, continued to testify that his risk of violence was extremely low under treatment. They explained that his schizophrenia was well managed with medication, that he understood the necessity of continuing his regimen, and that he expressed remorse for what he had done. By 2015, the review board determined that Lee could live in the community under strict supervision, a decision that many found unbearable. Supervised release meant he could work, shop, and even live independently, provided he followed medical orders and remained under monitoring. For Tim's family, it was inconceivable. They lived with the knowledge that their son's killer was breathing free air while their child rested in a grave. In 2017, Vince Lee legally changed his name to Will Baker and was granted an absolute discharge, meaning he was no longer under the authority of the review board and could live without restrictions. The decision stunned the nation. To medical experts, it was the culmination of years of successful treatment and proof that he no longer posed a risk. To the McLean family, it was a devastating betrayal. Carol stood before reporters once again, her voice breaking as she spoke of her son, reminding the public that Tim had no second chance, no opportunity for rehabilitation or a new life. She condemned the justice system that allowed the man who had decapitated and cannibalized her son to reintegrate into society with a new name and a chance at normalcy. The case had by then transcended its original horror to become a symbol of a larger struggle between justice, mental health, and public safety. Legal scholars debated whether the system had failed or whether it had demonstrated compassion in a way that many found uncomfortable. Mental health advocates argued that punishing those with severe illnesses would do nothing to prevent future tragedies and that treatment, not incarceration, was the only humane path forward. Victims' rights groups countered that compassion for perpetrators often left families like the McLeans with lifelong suffering and no sense of justice. The Greyhound bus murder had forced Canada into a conversation it could not easily resolve. For the passengers who had been on the bus that night, the release of Lee reopened old wounds. Many still carried invisible scars from what they had witnessed. Some lived with post-traumatic stress, unable to step onto buses or sit in confined public spaces without panic. For them, hearing that the man responsible was free and living under a new identity felt like a cruel reminder that their trauma would never fully heal. They had no escape from their memories, yet he had been granted one from his past. Tim McLean's legacy, however, lived on. His family and friends worked to keep his memory alive, describing him not through the lens of his death, but by the joy he brought during his life. They remembered his laughter, his adventurous spirit, and his kindness. For them, telling Tim's story was a way to honor who he was, not just how he died. His mother's advocacy became an extension of that legacy, her determination to protect others fueled by the love she continued to feel for her son. As the years passed, the horror of the Greyhound bus murder remained one of Canada's darkest chapters, a crime so random and savage that it defied explanation. It reminded a nation that safety can be shattered in an instant, that untreated mental illness can carry catastrophic consequences, and that justice, in its most complicated forms, does not always align with the grief of those left behind. For some, the resolution lay in believing that Lee had been sick, that treatment had restored his humanity, and that his release was proof of recovery. For others, no amount of healing could erase the brutality of that night, and the only acceptable outcome would have been permanent confinement. The story of Tim McLean and Vince Lee is not one that offers closure. It lingers as an open wound, as much about unanswered questions as it is about the crime itself. It speaks to the fragility of life, the randomness of violence, and the limits of human compassion in the face of horror. On that summer night in 2008, a bus traveling along the Trans-Canada Highway became the setting for an act of unimaginable violence. What followed was a journey not only of grief and outrage but of national reflection on what it means to balance mercy with justice. Tim's life, cut short in a moment of madness, continues to echo through every conversation about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the rights of victims. His story is a haunting reminder that behind every headline is a family forever changed, and behind every debate are wounds that time cannot fully heal. In a quiet English town, a young couple's walk through the park became a night of unthinkable horror. Sophie Lancaster and her boyfriend were attacked simply for looking different. What followed was a crime that shocked a nation and changed laws forever. This is the story you cannot ignore. On the evening of August 11, 2007, the quiet town of Bacup in Lancashire was winding down to another summer night. The air was still, the small community resting under the kind of silence that only small English towns know well. But within that calm, a young couple walked side by side, unaware that their night would turn into one of the most shocking crimes Britain would come to remember. Sophie Lancaster, 20 years old, with dark hair framing her pale face, walked hand in hand with her boyfriend Robert Maltby. Both shared a love for the Gothic subculture. Their clothes were dark, their accessories bold, and their manner different from those who conformed to ordinary fashion. To them, this was not just style but an expression of identity, art, and individuality. They had spent years together, bound not only by love, but by a world of music, literature, and creativity. Their choice of dress and their identity made them stand out wherever they went. To many, they were harmless. To some, they were targets. Robert was a student at the Manchester School of Art, brimming with creative ambition, while Sophie, equally gifted, had dreams of working in the arts and literature. Friends described Sophie as kind, thoughtful, and gentle, someone who would go out of her way to care for others. She was deeply protective of Robert, and on that night, she walked beside him with no thought that their bond would soon be tested in the cruelest way imaginable. The evening had started uneventfully. Sophie and Robert wandered into Stubby Park, a familiar route and a place that carried no sense of danger. But as darkness thickened, the park became a space shared with a group of teenagers loitering near the pathways. That group of 5 boys, all local to Bacup, were restless, bored, and already marked by a reputation for trouble. Their ages ranged from 15 to 17. They carried with them an arrogance that often comes with youth, mixed with recklessness and a desire to provoke. That night, they found their focus in Robert and Sophie. The first words were mocking, aimed at Robert for his appearance. The dark eyeliner, the long coat, the hair, everything about him was fuel for ridicule. For the teenagers, whose understanding of masculinity and identity was narrow, Robert was an easy target. What began as sneers quickly escalated into shoving, and soon fists were raised. Robert, outnumbered, tried to hold his ground, but it became clear there was no escape. The boys surrounded him, fists and feet landing blow after blow. His body crumpled as the attacks grew more violent. Kicks to his head rained down as he fell to the ground, unable to defend himself. He was unconscious before he could even process what was happening. It was in that moment that Sophie's instinct for protection surfaced. Without hesitation, she knelt beside Robert, her arms stretched across him as if to shield him from further harm. Her words, pleading for the attackers to stop, were ignored. Instead, her act of love became the reason she too became their target. The gang turned their violence on her, stamping and kicking her head with a level of brutality that suggested not just anger but hatred. Witnesses later recalled that the boys seemed to treat it as a form of entertainment, laughing as they delivered each kick, as though it were some kind of sport. The sound of blows landing echoed through the park, but no one came at first. Sophie's body was motionless, yet the kicks continued. By the time the attackers moved away, both she and Robert lay unconscious on the ground, side by side, their lives hanging in balance. The gang dispersed, leaving the park littered with silence once again, as though nothing had happened. It was only when passers-by entered the park that the horror was discovered. 2 figures lay battered and bloodied, barely recognizable as the vibrant young couple who had walked through only minutes before. Emergency services were called, and paramedics rushed to the scene. Robert was breathing but unresponsive. Sophie's condition was worse. She was rushed to hospital, placed in intensive care, and doctors quickly realized her injuries were catastrophic. Severe trauma to her head left her in a coma from which she would never awaken. News of the attack spread quickly through Bacup. Families of the victims arrived at the hospital, overwhelmed by the brutality inflicted on their children. For Robert, the path to survival would be long, his injuries severe but not fatal. For Sophie, her family held on to hope, but as days passed, that hope grew smaller. The swelling in her brain showed no signs of reducing. Machines kept her alive, but she was unresponsive. Her mother, Sylvia Lancaster, remained by her bedside, unwilling to accept that her daughter's life had been stolen for something so senseless. As police began their investigation, details of the attack emerged with shocking clarity. Witness statements painted a picture of sheer cruelty. Teenagers who laughed as they kicked Sophie and Robert, who saw their difference not as individuality but as justification for violence. Arrests were quickly made, the suspects rounded up and questioned. Their ages shocked the nation. They were not hardened criminals but boys barely into their mid-teens. Yet the violence they inflicted was far beyond what most could comprehend. For the community of Bacup, disbelief and anger ran deep. Parents questioned how children so young could commit such acts. Teachers, neighbors, and friends spoke of the attackers' reputations. Rowdy, aggressive, prone to trouble. But none could fully explain how mockery had escalated into attempted murder. In those first days, the attack seemed like a senseless act of teenage cruelty. It would soon be recognized as something deeper, an act of hate directed at people simply because of how they looked. As Sophie remained in her coma, her mother and loved ones clung to every slight movement, every sign that she might return. But 13 days after the attack on August 24, 2007, the decision was made to withdraw life support. The young woman whose life had been built on kindness, creativity, and individuality was gone. She had become the victim of an attack so shocking it would forever alter how Britain thought about hate crimes. Her death was not just the end of her story. It was the beginning of a movement, a demand for recognition that prejudice does not only exist in matters of race, religion, or sexuality. It can also exist against those who choose to live differently, to look different, to express themselves outside of the mainstream. The murder of Sophie Lancaster was not just a crime against one young woman. It was a crime against the freedom to be different. In the days that followed Sophie's death, the small town of Bacup found itself thrust into the national spotlight. The story of the young woman murdered for her appearance resonated far beyond Lancashire, becoming a point of reflection for the entire country. Newspapers splashed her photograph across front pages, showing a pale-faced young woman with dark hair and striking eyes, her style a reflection of the subculture that defined her identity. For many, it was a wake-up call. This was not just a random act of violence, but an expression of prejudice that had gone unchecked for too long. As investigators pieced together what happened that night in Stubbley Park, the details were as chilling as they were heartbreaking. Witness accounts revealed the gang had mocked Robert for his appearance before violence erupted. Robert, though creative and passionate, was not a fighter. He had no chance against a group of boys whose intent was not simply to intimidate but to destroy. When Sophie tried to intervene, the brutality escalated, and her act of love, throwing her body over Robert's to protect him, became her undoing. Police gathered statements from onlookers and associates of the perpetrators, building a case that left little doubt about the viciousness of the attack. The suspects were rounded up quickly, their names soon to become infamous. Ryan Herbert, just 16 years old, and Brendan Harris, only 15, were identified as the ringleaders, the ones who had carried out the most violent of the kicks. Alongside them were three others, Daniel Mallet, 17, and brothers Joseph and Danny Hume, aged 17 and 16. These boys, barely out of childhood, now stood accused of acts that had ended a life and scarred another forever. During questioning, their lack of remorse became apparent. Accounts emerged of them bragging afterward, recounting the attack with laughter, as though it had been a source of amusement rather than horror. The legal system moved with grim determination. Sophie's death, coupled with Robert's grievous injuries, meant charges were serious and unavoidable. Herbert and Harris were charged with murder, while the others faced charges of grievous bodily harm. For the Crown Prosecution Service, it was clear this was not simply an assault gone too far. The teenagers had displayed deliberate intent, repeatedly targeting the heads of their victims in what could only be described as acts of calculated violence. As the case developed, Sophie's family lived a nightmare no parent should endure. Her mother, Sylvia Lancaster, struggled not only with her grief, but with the incomprehensible reality that her daughter had been killed because she looked different. Sylvia had raised Sophie to be proud of her individuality, to embrace creativity, and to live authentically. Now, that very authenticity had been used as justification for her murder. Standing by Robert's side, who was still recovering from the physical and psychological scars of the attack, Sylvia resolved that Sophie's death could not be in vain. The courtroom became the stage where the brutality of that night was laid bare. Jurors were forced to listen to the harrowing details. The laughter of the attackers as they delivered the blows, the descriptions of Sophie lying motionless while still being kicked, and the chilling lack of empathy from those responsible. Forensic evidence confirmed the ferocity of the attack, with both victims sustaining catastrophic injuries to the head. The trial drew intense public attention, not only because of the crime but because of what it symbolized, a deep prejudice against people who dared to look different. For Robert, the trial was excruciating. Still healing from his injuries, he was confronted with the reality of what had been taken from him. Sophie had not only been his partner but his confidant, his equal in art, music, and imagination. He described her as a gentle soul, someone who saw the good in others and who, in her final moments, had chosen to protect him rather than flee. His survival carried the weight of trauma and guilt, a reminder that love had cost Sophie her life. The judge overseeing the case, Mr. Justice Russell, delivered words that echoed across the nation. He condemned the attackers for their barbarity, noting the sheer cruelty involved in kicking a young woman to death simply because she chose to live differently. In sentencing, Herbert and Harris were given life imprisonment, though as juveniles their minimum terms were set lower than for adults. Herbert received a minimum of 16 years, Harris 18. The others received sentences for grievous bodily harm. For many, the punishments did not feel enough, but they represented a recognition of the gravity of the crime. What made the case particularly significant was the way it was classified. This was one of the first times in the United Kingdom that a murder was formally recognized as a hate crime motivated not by race, religion, or sexuality, but by lifestyle and appearance. For the goth and alternative communities, this acknowledgement was monumental. For years, they had endured ridicule, bullying, and sometimes violence, yet society often dismissed it as harmless teasing. Sophie's murder forced the nation to see the reality that prejudice against subcultures could be just as destructive as any other form of hate. Outside the courtroom, the public responded with vigils, memorials, and outpourings of support for Sophie's family. Flowers and tributes were laid in Bacup and beyond, messages pouring in from people who had never met her, but who felt connected through shared experiences of being different. The goth community, in particular, rallied around Sophie's memory, seeing her as a symbol of the struggles they had long faced in silence. It was in this atmosphere of grief and outrage that Sylvia Lancaster began her campaign to ensure her daughter's story made a difference. Determined that Sophie's life would not be defined solely by her brutal death, Sylvia founded the Sophie Lancaster Foundation. Its mission was clear: to challenge prejudice, promote tolerance, and work with schools, communities, and law enforcement to recognize and address hate crimes against alternative subcultures. Her tireless efforts brought Sophie's story into classrooms and training sessions, where police officers and young people alike learned about the consequences of intolerance. The impact of Sophie's murder stretched further than anyone could have anticipated. Festivals, music events, and charities embraced her memory, creating platforms for awareness and education. Each initiative carried with it the message that no one should suffer violence for simply being who they are. Sophie's face became an emblem, her story told not only as a tragedy but as a call for change. Yet for her loved ones, beneath the public campaigns and the national conversations, the grief remained personal and raw. Robert, though alive, struggled with the psychological scars. Survivors often carry guilt, and for him, the knowledge that Sophie had died protecting him was a burden that weighed heavily. Sylvia continued to speak publicly, but behind her strength was the sorrow of a mother who had lost her child in the most brutal of ways. By the end of the trial, the facts were laid bare, and justice, in legal terms, was delivered. But justice could not bring Sophie back. The gang of teenagers had acted out of cruelty and prejudice, and their actions had changed the lives of two families forever. Bacup, once a quiet town, would always be remembered as the place where Sophie's light was extinguished. And for Britain, the murder became a turning point, a moment when society was forced to ask itself difficult questions about the price of intolerance and the dangers of letting hate fester unchecked. The years following Sophie Lancaster's murder were marked not only by grief but by transformation. What began as a single act of cruelty in a dark park grew into a national conversation about hate, identity, and the right to live without fear of persecution for one's appearance. Sophie's death had drawn a line in the sand. It demanded that the United Kingdom confront a form of prejudice that had long gone unrecognized, and it gave her mother, Sylvia Lancaster, a purpose that would define the rest of her life. Sylvia, once an ordinary mother leading a quiet life in Lancashire, became a voice that would echo through schools, police forces, and political chambers. Her grief sharpened into determination as she told Sophie's story again and again. She spoke of her daughter's kindness, her creativity, and her individuality. She spoke of the night in Stubbley Park when that individuality became the reason for violence. But most importantly, she spoke of the need for change. The Sophie Lancaster Foundation, known simply as SOPHIE, Stamp Out Prejudice, Hatred, and Intolerance Everywhere, became her weapon against the ignorance that had killed her daughter. The Foundation's message was simple yet powerful. People should never be judged or attacked for who they are, how they dress, or what culture they belong to. Sylvia and her team entered classrooms where young people often learned intolerance from peers or even from the environments around them. They trained police forces to recognize that prejudice could extend beyond race and religion, reminding them that appearance-based hostility was real, damaging, and often overlooked. Slowly, Sophie's story began to influence policy. Greater Manchester Police, among others, recognized alternative subcultures as a protected category in hate crime reporting. It was a milestone, born from tragedy, that gave a voice to thousands who had lived with silent abuse. Yet even as awareness spread, the personal cost remained heavy. For Robert Maltby, Sophie's surviving boyfriend, the road was one of survival but not of healing. He returned to art, trying to channel his pain into his work, but interviews in the years that followed revealed the scars he carried. The memory of Sophie's final moments, her shielding his body with hers, never left him. He admitted feeling guilt for being alive, for being the one she had tried to protect. Though he received support, the trauma was lifelong. Every time he looked back at photographs of Sophie, smiling in her Gothic attire, he was reminded of the senselessness of her absence. The perpetrators, meanwhile, faced their prison sentences. Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris, the ringleaders, grew into adulthood behind bars. Periodic parole reviews reignited public anger, with Sophie's family forced to relive the events whenever the attackers sought release. Herbert was eventually transferred to an open prison after years of incarceration, a decision that sparked fierce debate. For some, justice could never be enough. No sentence would equate to the life taken and the suffering caused. The names of the attackers, once local delinquents, became permanently tied to one of the most infamous hate crimes in modern British history. Public remembrance of Sophie took many forms. Music festivals across the country honored her memory, with stages dedicated to raising awareness of tolerance. At Bloodstock, a major metal festival, the SOPHIE stage became a fixture, blending her love for alternative music with the mission of fighting prejudice. Bands and artists spoke of her during performances, reminding audiences that the freedom to express oneself through music, fashion, and culture should never be a matter of life and death. Tattoos bearing Sophie's name and the Foundation's black ribbon logo became symbols worn proudly by thousands. Each mark a pledge to carry forward her legacy. In Bacup, the memory of the night lingered. The town, once unknown to much of Britain, became synonymous with tragedy. Local schools adopted educational programs to teach young people about tolerance and the dangers of mob mentality. Sophie's story was taught as a lesson in the destructive power of hate and the importance of empathy. Her murder had not only shaken the community but reshaped it, forcing it to confront its failures and seek a path toward compassion. Sylvia Lancaster, as the years went on, continued to be a figurehead of resilience. She spoke on television, at conferences, and in halls filled with teenagers, always carrying a photograph of Sophie with her. Her voice, often steady but lined with pain, reminded people that behind every campaign and every statistic was a real human being whose life had been stolen. She often described Sophie as someone who had simply wanted to live authentically, someone who harmed no one, someone who should have had a future. In her speeches, she would sometimes pause, the weight of memory pressing on her, but she always finished with the same call, to stand against hate in all its forms. Her efforts did not go unrecognized. Sylvia was awarded an OBE for her services to community cohesion, a tribute not only to her work but to Sophie's legacy. Yet Sylvia herself admitted that no award could fill the void left by her daughter's absence. In private, she mourned as any mother would, with quiet moments of reflection and heartbreak. Still, she pressed forward, knowing that her campaigning was the only way to make sense of the senseless. Over time, Sophie's story became part of the wider narrative of modern hate crimes. Documentaries retold the events of that night, interviews with Robert and Sylvia keeping her memory alive. Plays, books, and artworks captured the tragedy and the message it carried. Each retelling ensured that Sophie's name was not forgotten, that she remained more than a victim. She became a symbol of the fight against prejudice. But the legacy of such a crime is never clean. The questions lingered. How could children so young carry such hate? What kind of environment breeds the belief that difference deserves violence? Some pointed to peer pressure, to the culture of mocking those who stand out, to the desensitization of violence in certain circles. Others saw it as a failure of society at large to instill empathy and respect in its youth. Whatever the reasons, the truth remained that Sophie's death was preventable. Had someone intervened sooner, had the attackers been guided differently in life, perhaps the night in Stubby Park would have ended in nothing more than words. Years later, anniversaries of Sophie's death continued to be marked with vigils and memorials. Each gathering was a reminder that though she was gone, her impact endured. Candles were lit, stories shared, and music played in her honor. The goth and alternative communities, often marginalized, found solidarity in her name, standing together to demand recognition and respect. Parents used her story to teach their children about kindness, about the importance of allowing others to be themselves. The story of Sophie Lancaster is one that does not fade. It continues to serve as a warning about the destructive potential of prejudice and the thin line between cruelty and tragedy. It reminds society of its duty to protect those who dare to be different, to ensure that individuality is celebrated rather than punished. And above all, it preserves the memory of a young woman who lived authentically, loved deeply, and died because of a hatred she never deserved. For Robert, for Sylvia, and for all who knew her, the pain remains. But so too does the determination that Sophie's life, though cut short, will forever carry meaning. She may have left this world in silence, lying in a park under the stars, but her story has echoed across generations. In that echo lives a promise, that Sophie Lancaster will not be forgotten, and that her death will continue to inspire the fight against hate, prejudice, and violence, wherever it appears. A picture-perfect family, a quiet suburban home, and a father who seemed devoted, until one summer night in 2018 shattered the illusion forever. This is the haunting story of Chris Watts, a tale of betrayal, deception, and unimaginable tragedy that will leave you questioning how well we ever know anyone. In the quiet suburb of Frederick, Colorado, life often moved at a slow, predictable pace. Families filled the neighborhood streets, children played in yards, and the community thrived on the comforting rhythm of small-town America. It was the kind of place where people left doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where appearances mattered. At the center of one seemingly perfect family was Chris and Sean and Watts. To outsiders, they embodied the American dream. A loving marriage, 2 beautiful daughters, a 3rd child on the way, and a tidy suburban home with a manicured lawn. Their smiles on social media painted the portrait of happiness. But behind that digital lens was a reality that would unravel into one of the most chilling family annihilation cases in modern history. Sean and Watts had built an image that seemed to radiate positivity. She was 34, energetic, and determined, a woman who wore her heart proudly on her sleeve. Friends described her as vibrant and unstoppable, someone who took challenges head-on. As a Thrive brand promoter, she was used to being in the spotlight, often documenting her life in photos and videos that showcased her love for her children and devotion to her husband. To those who followed her online, her family life appeared near perfect, full of laughter, affection, and gratitude. She often spoke about how lucky she felt to have Chris, how blessed she was to raise Bella and Celeste, and how excited she was about the baby they had already named Nico. But Chris was not like Sean and, at 33, he worked quietly as an oil field operator for Anadarko Petroleum. Reserved, soft-spoken, and somewhat introverted, he was the opposite of his outgoing wife. Many who knew him described him as a nice guy, someone who never raised his voice, a father who appeared to adore his daughters. To Shanann's friends, he seemed to be the calm counterpart to her energy. Yet, beneath that surface, Chris harbored growing detachment and secrets that no one could have predicted. He had begun a relationship with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger, a woman who believed he was preparing to separate from Sean and, to her, Chris was a man ready to build a new life, a man trapped in an unhappy marriage and seeking freedom. What Nicole did not know was that the freedom Chris envisioned would come at the cost of the very family he had created. As summer 2018 unfolded, tensions simmered in the Watts household. The couple's financial struggles weighed heavily. Behind the smiles and photos were debts, overdue bills, and mounting pressure. Sean and, determined to keep their lives afloat, worked tirelessly while also nurturing her children. Chris, however, grew increasingly distant. Friends noticed the shift. He no longer appeared affectionate. His texts lacked warmth, and his once cooperative nature had been replaced by cold indifference. For Sean and, who had invested her identity into being a devoted wife and mother, the emotional withdrawal was confusing and heartbreaking. She confided in friends about her worries, but continued to hope that Chris would return to the husband she believed him to be. By August, the rift between them had widened. Sean and had traveled on a business trip, leaving Chris at home with Bella and Celeste. During this time, he relished his freedom, spending time with Nicole, imagining what life could look like without his family. To Chris, the idea of starting over grew intoxicating. In his distorted mind, the responsibilities that once defined him became shackles, and the only way he believed he could escape was through a horrifying decision he had already begun to contemplate. In the early hours of August 13, 2018, Sean and returned home from her trip. A friend had dropped her off after midnight, unaware that it would be the last time she was seen alive. Surveillance cameras from the neighbor's house captured her walking to the front door, tired yet unsuspecting of the storm waiting inside. Chris, who had already resolved to act on his dark plan, confronted her in their bedroom. Accounts suggest an argument unfolded, centered on separation and his desire for a new life. For Sean and, it was likely a devastating revelation. For Chris, it became the moment he crossed the irreversible line. In cold calculation, he strangled her, extinguishing the life of his pregnant wife and the son they were expecting. The crime, however, did not end there. In a decision that defies comprehension, Chris turned his attention to his daughters. 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste were still alive, unaware of what had happened to their mother. Chris wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet and placed it in the truck, then loaded his daughters, alive and awake, into the back seat. The drive to the oil field stretched on, a surreal journey where innocence and death coexisted within the same vehicle. It is impossible to know what went through Bella and Celeste's minds as they sat near their mother's lifeless body, but what awaited them was a fate no child should ever endure. The oil site where Chris worked became the setting for his final act of betrayal. There, he smothered Celeste and then Bella. In a harrowing detail later revealed, Bella resisted, begging her father not to hurt her, crying out, "Daddy, no!" But his resolve, fueled by selfish desire, silenced her. He then concealed their small bodies inside separate oil tanks, submerging them in crude oil, while he buried Sean and in a shallow grave nearby. With mechanical efficiency, Chris attempted to erase the existence of the family he had once posed with in smiling photographs. By morning, the absence of Sean and raised alarm. She had a doctor's appointment that day, and her close friend, concerned after failing to reach her, contacted the police. Within hours, officers arrived at the Watts residence. Chris, feigning worry, played the role of the desperate husband and father, insisting that his family had simply vanished. He gave interviews to the media, pleading for their return, but his performance was unconvincing. Observers noted his emotionless demeanor, the flatness of his voice, and the way his words seemed hollow. Meanwhile, investigators grew suspicious. They examined the house and noticed signs that contradicted Chris's account. Neighbors provided surveillance footage that showed Chris backing his truck into the garage and moving suspiciously in the early hours of the morning. These details began to form cracks in his story. The once quiet man who blended into the background was suddenly at the center of a rapidly unraveling mystery, one that would soon expose the darkest truth imaginable. The case was just beginning, and the community that had once seen the Watts family as a model of suburban life was about to discover a reality more horrifying than anyone could have foreseen. As the sun rose over Frederick on August 13, 2018, the search for Sean and Bella and Celeste was already underway. Friends had been calling, sending messages, and knocking on the Watts' door. Shanann's close friend and confidant, Nicole Atkinson, grew increasingly uneasy when Sean and failed to respond. She knew Sean and had an important prenatal appointment that morning, something she would never miss. Concern turned into panic, and Nicole alerted the authorities. By the time officers arrived at the Watts home, Chris was already laying the groundwork for the story he would try to sell to the world. He greeted them with calm detachment, explaining that Sean had gone out and taken the children with her. To him, it was a simple explanation, one that might have seemed believable if not for the inconsistencies already bubbling to the surface. Police entered the Watts residence and immediately sensed something was off. The house looked undisturbed, but Shanann's purse, phone, and keys were all inside. For investigators, this was a red flag. A woman planning to leave her home would never go without essentials, especially when caring for two small children. Chris, however, remained oddly unbothered, pacing through the rooms, offering explanations that seemed thin. He claimed he and Sean had an emotional conversation about separating earlier that morning, but he insisted she left on her own afterward. His demeanor struck officers as flat, lacking the urgency or panic expected from a man whose pregnant wife and young daughters had suddenly vanished. As hours passed, the case shifted quickly from a missing persons report to something more sinister. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to anyone who might have seen the family. It was during one of these interactions that a critical piece of evidence surfaced. A neighbor, who had surveillance cameras pointing toward the Watts driveway, invited police inside to review the footage. What they saw raised more questions than it answered. In the early hours of August 13th, Chris was captured backing his truck into the garage, loading it multiple times before leaving. He claimed he was simply preparing for work, but the neighbor, watching Chris fidget nervously as the video played, told police he had never seen him act this way before. The seeds of suspicion were planted, and the investigation began to close in. Meanwhile, Chris attempted to maintain the role of the grieving husband. He spoke with local media outlets, appearing on camera to plead for the safe return of his family. Standing on his porch, arms folded and voice devoid of emotion, he insisted he had no idea where Sean and the girls had gone. To the public, his words rang hollow. Viewers across the country sensed something unsettling in his interviews. He did not cry, he did not beg. Instead, he seemed robotic, detached, as if rehearsing a role rather than experiencing genuine anguish. Behind the scenes, investigators were piecing together the fractured puzzle of Chris's life. Phone records, financial documents, and personal messages revealed a man living a double existence. He was entangled in a relationship with Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker who had believed his marriage was ending. Their text exchanges showed passion and excitement about a future together, discussions of vacations and new beginnings. Nicole later told police she had no idea Sean was pregnant, and upon realizing the truth, she cooperated fully with the investigation. For detectives, the motive was becoming clearer. Chris wanted to start over, unburdened by his family. but the facade continued to crumble. On August 15th, only 2 days after Shanann's disappearance, investigators requested that Chris take a polygraph test. Confident he could outsmart the system, he agreed. Sitting in the interrogation room, he answered questions while the machine recorded his physiological responses. When the test concluded, the examiner delivered a blunt assessment. "You did not pass." The words shattered the illusion Chris had clung to. Detectives pressed harder, leaning into his fragile composure. During hours of questioning, Chris initially clung to lies, insisting he knew nothing of his family's whereabouts. But cracks soon widened. Investigators offered him an opening, suggesting perhaps Shanann had harmed the children, and he reacted in rage. Grasping at the opportunity to deflect blame, Chris seized on the narrative. He claimed he had walked in to find Shanann strangling the girls and, in a fit of fury, killed her in retaliation. It was a desperate attempt to lessen his culpability, painting himself not as a cold-blooded killer but as a grieving father driven to a single act of violence. Detectives, however, saw through the fabrication. They knew the truth was far darker. They pressed him to reveal where the bodies were, and at last Chris confessed. In a chillingly matter-of-fact tone, he described driving Shanann and the girls to an oil site where he worked. There, he buried Shanann in a shallow grave and disposed of his daughters in separate oil tanks. Even as he recounted the horrific details, his voice remained steady, almost detached from the reality of his actions. For investigators, it was a moment of grim clarity. The missing persons case was no longer a mystery. It was a murder investigation of staggering cruelty. News of the confession spread quickly, shocking not only the community of Frederick but the nation at large. Friends and family of Shanann were devastated, struggling to reconcile the image of Chris, the quiet, unassuming man who had seemed like the perfect husband, with the reality of a father capable of killing his own children. Public outrage swelled as the details emerged, particularly the manner in which Bella and Celeste's lives had been taken. The image of Bella's final words, pleading with her father, haunted those who followed the case. As authorities recovered the bodies from the oil site, the grim reality set in. Shanann, still wearing the clothing from her trip, was pulled from the earth, while workers carefully extracted the bodies of Bella and Celeste from the tanks. The oil, thick and suffocating, had concealed them for days. The discovery confirmed the brutality of Chris's actions, eliminating any lingering doubt about his guilt. In the days that followed, the narrative of the Watts family shifted irrevocably. The smiling family photos that had once symbolized suburban bliss now became chilling reminders of what had been lost. Shanann, who had shared her life so openly with friends and followers online, became the face of a victim betrayed by the very person she trusted most. Bella and Celeste, remembered for their innocence and joy, became symbols of the cruelty inflicted upon children by a parent's selfishness. And Chris, the man who had appeared to the world as a devoted father, was revealed as a calculating murderer who valued his own desires above the lives of his family. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly to unravel the case, there was satisfaction in securing a confession, but it was tempered by the horror of the crime itself. No one could fully comprehend what drove Chris to such extremes, how a man who once kissed his daughters goodnight could smother the life out of them, or how he could discard their bodies as though they were obstacles to his happiness. The story was not over. The courts would soon decide Chris's fate, and the world would watch as the man who had annihilated his family faced justice. Yet even before the trial began, the Watts case had etched itself into the collective memory of America. A story of betrayal, secrecy, and the shattering of the illusion of perfection. When the truth finally emerged, Chris Watts stood exposed as the man who had destroyed the very family he once presented as perfect. The facade had crumbled, and now the world waited to see what justice would bring. His arrest sent shockwaves far beyond Colorado, drawing international attention. The story was almost too chilling to believe. A husband, father, and soon-to-be father again, extinguishing the lives of those who trusted him most, all for the promise of a new beginning with another woman. The public consumed every detail, desperate to understand how such evil could hide beneath such an ordinary mask. The legal process moved swiftly. Prosecutors faced the task of deciding whether to pursue the death penalty. Given the brutality of the crime, many expected they would. But Shanann's family, already burdened by unimaginable grief, made their wishes clear. They did not want further death. Out of respect for their wishes, prosecutors agreed to remove capital punishment from the table if Chris would plead guilty. It was a decision that would secure justice without the prolonged agony of a trial. In November 2018, Chris entered the courtroom and admitted to murdering Sean and Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico. One by one, the charges were read aloud, and one by one, he said the word guilty. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his admissions pressing down on everyone present. When the day of sentencing arrived, the atmosphere was thick with grief and anger. Shanann's family members stood to speak, their voices trembling as they addressed the man who had stolen everything from them. Her father, Frank Razusek, described Sean as a woman full of love and determination, a daughter who had been his pride and joy. Her mother, Sandra, through tears, told Chris she forgave him but left him with the haunting reminder that he would have to live with the consequences of his choices for the rest of his life. Their words revealed not only pain but also a strength rooted in faith and resilience. Prosecutors detailed the crimes in stark, unflinching terms. They spoke of how Shanann's final moments were spent struggling against the man she trusted, of how Bella fought back in desperation, of how Celeste never had a chance to understand what was happening. The brutality of the murders was laid bare, leaving the courtroom shaken. The judge, visibly disturbed, called the case the most inhumane and vicious he had seen in his entire career. When he delivered his ruling, it was with the certainty that Chris would never walk free again. He was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for unlawful termination of a pregnancy and tampering with bodies. With those words, Chris Watts disappeared into the prison system, destined to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Even with sentencing complete, the story did not end. From prison, Chris continued to draw attention, granting interviews and providing chilling glimpses into his mindset. He admitted in greater detail how he had carried out the murders, clarifying the events of that night with a cold, almost detached recounting. He spoke of arguing with Sean and of feeling trapped, of wanting to start anew with Nicole Kessinger. He described loading Shanann's body into his truck while his daughters asked what was wrong with their mother. He admitted to smothering Celeste and then Bella, acknowledging that Bella's last words had been a desperate plea for her life. These confessions only deepened the horror, painting a clearer picture of a man who placed his own desires above every bond of love and responsibility. For many, no explanation was sufficient. How could a father look into the eyes of his child and commit such an act? Psychologists and criminal experts dissected his behavior, labeling it a classic case of family annihilation. Such crimes, though rare, often stem from men who feel trapped by financial burdens, marital tension, or extramarital affairs. Rather than facing the shame of failure or the effort of divorce, they choose a darker path, erasing their families to create the illusion of a fresh start. In Chris Watts, they saw a man whose outward calm concealed a dangerous selfishness, one capable of transforming into violence when his fantasy of freedom clashed with reality. The impact of the murders rippled outward. Shanann's family was left to grieve in the most public way imaginable. Their daughter and grandchildren turned into symbols of tragedy. Friends who had once marveled at Shanann's positivity now struggled with the knowledge of how much pain she had endured in private. The town of Frederick, once proud of its quiet safety, became known worldwide as the place where the Watts family murders occurred. Even Nicole Kessinger, who had no part in the crime itself, found her life upended. Branded by association, she vanished from public view, her name forever linked to a case she never intended to be part of. In the years that followed, documentaries, books, and countless online discussions continued to analyze the case. The Netflix documentary American Murder, The Family Next Door, brought Shanann's story to millions, piecing together her life through the videos she had left behind. Viewers watched as she expressed her love, her hopes, her fears, and her devotion, never realizing those clips would one day serve as haunting reminders of what was stolen. The documentary also revealed the chilling transformation of Chris, from the smiling father in family photos to the man shifting nervously under the weight of suspicion. For many, it was the transparency of Shanann's digital footprint that made the story all the more personal. It was no longer just a headline. It was the destruction of a family whose lives had been laid out for all to see. Yet beyond the media attention, the story served as a sobering lesson. It highlighted the dangers of assuming that social media tells the whole truth, reminding people that even the brightest smiles can mask deep fractures. It also forced conversations about the psychology of domestic violence, about how manipulation and hidden resentment can escalate into unthinkable acts. The Watts murders became not just a tale of tragedy but a case study for law enforcement, psychologists, and communities seeking to understand and prevent similar horrors. For Shanann's family, the healing process has been long and painful. They established foundations in her memory, working to honor her life and the lives of Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Through their efforts, they strive to ensure that their story is not defined solely by how it ended, but by the love and vibrancy Shan and brought to the world and the joy her children radiated during their short lives. Their mission is to transform tragedy into advocacy, giving voice to victims of domestic violence and family annihilation. Inside prison walls, Chris Watts lives a life of isolation and routine, stripped of the freedoms he once destroyed others to obtain. Reports suggest he spends his days reading the Bible and reflecting on his actions, but to many, his words ring as hollow as they did on his front porch during those first interviews. For the public, there is no redemption strong enough to outweigh the enormity of his crimes. His name has become synonymous with betrayal and selfish cruelty, a permanent reminder of how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. The story of the Watts family remains etched into the collective memory of America and beyond. It is a narrative of shattered trust, of innocence stolen, of love betrayed in its most violent form. It serves as a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary lives, secrets can fester until they erupt with devastating consequences. The photographs of Shan and Bella and Celeste, smiling brightly in happier times, now serve not just as memorials but as urgent symbols of vigilance and awareness. And for those who continue to ask why, the painful truth lingers. Some answers will never fully satisfy, because the depth of such betrayal cannot be rationalized.